Genevieve Daniels had never planned to be a housekeeper. Growing up in rural Georgia, she'd had dreams of becoming an entrepreneur, someone who would own her own business and stand proudly at the helm. But life has a way of presenting unexpected detours. By the time she turned 20, financial burdens weighed her down. Her family struggled, having endured one misfortune after another. So when she saw the newspaper ad for housekeeping staff at the new Harvest Crown Hotel in Atlanta, Genevieve decided a steady paycheck was more important than chasing distant aspirations. She arrived on a warm August morning for her first day. The building, tall and imposing, stood in a bustling neighborhood, overshadowing smaller motels nearby. Its exterior boasted bold signage: Harvest Crown, where comfort meets class. Genevieve smoothed her hair, refusing to let nerves get the better of her. Dressed in a modest skirt and blouse she'd borrowed from a cousin, she stepped inside. The lobby was a world of polished marble floors, gold-accented columns and chandeliers. She couldn't help inhaling sharply at its grandeur, her reflection briefly appearing beneath her feet. Guests in sleek business attire hurried to and fro, their heels tapping the stone. The air hummed with the mingled scents of coffee, leather, and a whiff of lemon polish. A woman at the front desk, pale, sharp-featured, took in Genevieve's appearance with a tight smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, in that tone that implied she wasn't sure she wanted to help. Genevieve summoned a polite smile of her own. "I'm here for the housekeeping position. Where should I report?" The receptionist, whose name tag read Patricia, pointed down a hallway to the Human Resources office. Paperwork was uneventful, though the HR assistant, a short man with thinning hair, barely looked Genevieve in the eye. After 20 minutes of formalities, she was handed a dull grey uniform and told to report to housekeeping manager Ms. Pilcher. "You can find Ms. Pilcher on the 7th floor, storage room," the HR assistant said, already distracted by the next item on his desk. Genevieve navigated the elevator bank, jostled among guests and staff. The 7th floor was carpeted in a tasteful burgundy. Framed black and white photographs of old Atlanta lined the walls. Historic city views that contrasted with the modern amenities. A large metal door read, "Housekeeping, authorized personnel only." She slipped through, heart pounding. Miss Pilcher was a petite woman with a stiff posture. Her hair was coiled in a bun so tight Genevieve wondered if it gave her headaches. "Ah, you must be Genevieve," she said, voice clipped. "Uniform's there. Once you change, come back here." In the cramped locker room, Genevieve found two other housekeepers chatting softly in Spanish. They paused as she entered, eyes curious, yet kind. "Hola?" Genevieve offered in a shy greeting, receiving nods in return. She changed quickly into the shapeless uniform, feeling an odd flush of self-consciousness. She'd never worn anything so starkly industrial. Back in the storage room, Miss Pilcher outlined Genevieve's duties: vacuuming halls, cleaning rooms, changing linens, restocking toiletries. "We have a system," Ms. Pilcher said, tapping a clipboard. "We expect speed and thoroughness. Don't dawdle. Don't chat with guests unless they need something." Genevieve tried to remain attentive, ignoring a subtle tension in Ms. Pilcher's tone. She sensed a certain watchful disapproval, though she couldn't pinpoint its source. Maybe it was just first-day jitters. Midway through the shift, the hotel manager, Mr. Leo Crenshaw, arrived to check on housekeeping progress. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, wearing an immaculate suit. His watch glinted under the fluorescent lights, a reflection dancing across his imposing brow. Ms. Pilcher snapped to attention, posture even straighter. "Everything in order here?" he asked. His gaze flicked over the staff. When he spotted Genevieve, her dark complexion and new uniform, His lips curled into something resembling a smile, yet held no warmth. "You're new?" "Yes, sir," Genevieve said quietly, meeting his eyes with polite respect. "Well, Ms. Pilcher runs a tight ship," Crenshaw said, his voice cool. "Let's see if you can keep up." With that, he turned on his heel. Ms. Pilcher relaxed fractionally, exhaling. Genevieve realized the manager's presence inspired fear, or at least a certain tension. She asked the woman next to her, "Is it always like this?" The housekeeper, Marta, just shrugged with a sympathetic smile. "He's always stiff." Genevieve completed her day's tasks, returning home exhausted but determined. Deep inside, an inkling of a dream still flickered. She remembered the child she once was, the girl who drew pictures of shops she would someday own, or hotels she'd brand with her name in bold letters. Today's job might be a far cry from that, but it was a start. Little did she know, it would be a rocky road, a path lined with prejudice and heartbreak, and eventually triumph beyond her wildest dreams. Genevieve quickly learned the hotel's unspoken hierarchy. Housekeepers were near the bottom, treated like invisible cogs in a glitzy machine. She'd be cleaning a corridor, while guests stepped around her as though she were part of the scenery. A passing bellhop, ironically, treated her more kindly, giving her a quick grin and offering to share leftover coffee from the lounge. Others were less hospitable. One day, Patricia from the front desk sighed dramatically when Genevieve asked if there were extra cleaning supplies. "That's not my job," she sniffed. "You people keep your stock in that closet by the freight elevator. Go check there." You people, Genevieve thought, anger twisting her stomach. But she kept quiet, refusing to let the moment define her. Instead, she approached Miss Pilcher, who told her to mind your own business and figure it out. No help there either. Meanwhile, Mr. Crenshaw began to appear more often. Twice, Genevieve found him waiting as she emerged from a guest room with her cleaning cart. Each time he asked pointed questions. "How fast can you complete your rounds? Did you thoroughly vacuum the edges? Did any guests complain about noise?" He always addressed her in a condescending tone, as if expecting her to fail. Genevieve refused to show frustration, but inside, seeds of resentment began to grow. She recognized prejudice in the way he lingered on certain staff, those who were immigrants, those who were black. She saw how his conversations with employees of color were laced with microaggressions or impatience he never showed the white front desk staff. Gradually, Genevieve befriended a small circle of co-workers. Marta, the Spanish-speaking housekeeper, taught her shortcuts for cleaning tubs more efficiently. Rod, an older black bellhop, gave her tips on navigating the manager's scrutiny. "Stick to the guidelines," he advised, "and keep your head down. They can't fault you if you do everything exactly right." Rod's advice served Genevieve well. She put in extra effort, double-checking each room so that no one could accuse her of sloppiness. She even devised a rotating system to dust the corners behind large furniture, ensuring a truly spotless environment. Guests began leaving favourable notes about their clean rooms. Word even reached Miss Pilcher, who grudgingly acknowledged, "You do decent work." Still, the hostility from higher-ups persisted. One evening, while cleaning the executive suite after a VIP checked out, Genevieve paused to admire the view of the Atlanta skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panorama of skyscrapers glittering in the distance. In that moment, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass, her uniform modest, her hair pinned up. She wondered what it would be like to stand in that suite as an honoured guest, or better yet, as someone in charge. Lost in thought, She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until Mr. Crenshaw's voice snapped her back. "Gawking on the clock?" he asked, crossing the plush carpet with an air of ownership. "No, sir," Genevieve said, bowing her head. The skyline is beautiful." He glanced at the window. "Guests pay for the view, Miss Daniels. They don't pay for you to admire it." Heat flared in her cheeks. She stifled a retort, some half-formed protest about how a moment's pause didn't harm anyone. Instead, she answered with a polite, "I'll get back to work," and continued changing the sheets. Crenshaw remained, arms folded, watching her every move. A mild tremor slipped into her hands as she tucked the crisp sheets around the mattress. She hated how small she felt under his gaze. Eventually, he left without another word, but the moment had left a sour taste in her mouth. This dynamic deepened as the weeks wore on. If Genevieve's cart was left a half-inch off-centre in a hallway, Crenshaw commented. If she took a brief water break in the staff lounge, he questioned how long she'd been away from her duties. One day, she overheard him reprimanding Miss Pilcher about that new girl who still hasn't learned her place. Genevieve confided in Rod, tears in her eyes. "I'm trying my best," she said. "Why does he hate me?" Rod laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He sees you as less than. Never forget that this world has folks who look down on us for the colour of our skin. But don't let it break you. Keep going. Keep your vision." "What vision?" she asked bitterly. "I'm making minimum wage, cleaning toilets for a man who can't even muster a smile." Rod smiled softly. "All storms pass. Don't let him steal your dreams." That night, Genevieve lay on her old, squeaking mattress in the small studio apartment she rented. She stared at the curling paint on the ceiling, remembering the doodles she once made of her future big business. Maybe the dream wasn't entirely dead. She resolved to save money, keep her eyes open for opportunities. Even if the day she walked out of the Harvest Crown Hotel seemed a distant fantasy, she'd at least gather the resources to stand on firmer ground. Little did Genevieve know, storms don't merely pass, they test your resilience. She was about to face challenges that would bend her nearly to breaking. But from those trials, she'd awakened the fire that had once burned bright in her younger self. Fall ushered in a busy conference season, bringing streams of new guests to the Harvest Crown. Sales groups, travelling executives, and out-of-state tourists jostled the lobby each morning, coffee cups in hand. For housekeepers like Genevieve, it meant more rooms to clean, more stress, and less time to breathe. She often felt overlooked, slipping in and out of rooms while people bustled by. One morning, she was assigned the penthouse floor, a rarity for junior housekeepers. The penthouse suite was the hotel's crown jewel. Sprawling living area, a private balcony with city views, even a grand piano. None of the staff dared touch. Miss Pilcher gave her a once-over and said, "Don't mess this up." Genevieve arrived with her cart, carefully scanning a checklist. The occupant had just checked out, some big-shot investment banker. She dusted surfaces meticulously. As she moved to wipe down a glass coffee table, she noticed a thick business magazine. The bold headline read, "Real Estate Booms in Atlanta, Where to Invest." Her eyes flicked across paragraphs describing skyrocketing property values, how small investors could break into the market by pooling resources or taking advantage of certain loan programs. It felt like a foreign language, but something about it hooked her interest. She turned a page, gleaning a few lines about commercial properties. She had never seriously thought about investing, but a spark ignited, reminding her of those childhood dreams. She lingered too long. Miss Pilcher's voice cut through the hush. "Why are you loitering?" Genevieve set the magazine aside, flushing. Sorry, I was just... I don't care. Finish the room. Genevieve nodded meekly, tucking away curiosity for later. Yet the words she'd read continued to echo in her mind. That evening, after her shift, she visited the public library. She borrowed books on basic real estate principles, scanning them in the quiet corners. Her eyes widened at the possibilities, from house flipping to commercial rentals. It was all hypothetical. She only had a modest savings account. But an ember of hope glowed again. At the hotel, prejudice intensified. A subtle practice took root. Certain managers gave easy tasks to staff they favoured, leaving more grueling jobs for Genevieve and others of colour. She noticed how Ms. Pilcher offered the top-floor housekeeping rotations to new white hires who had arrived after Genevieve, while pushing Genevieve to do laundry duty in the bowels of the basement. Lunchtimes were no better. Genevieve sometimes sat alone in the staff cafeteria, seeing how a few employees formed exclusive cliques. She'd greet them, only to receive mumbled replies or polite smiles that vanished once she turned away. The isolation weighed on her, but she tried to keep up her positivity, forging a closer bond with the handful of welcoming colleagues like Marta and Rod. One day, a guest singled her out for blatant discrimination. As she was vacuuming the corridor on the 12th floor, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit stepped out of his room. He eyed Genevieve suspiciously. "Hey," he barked, "my bathroom sink isn't draining right. Can I get a regular housekeeper in there? No offence, but do you know how to fix anything?" Genevieve's chest tightened. She responded as calmly as she could. "I can take a look, sir, or call maintenance if it's serious." He snorted. "I just want it done right. Been having issues with lazy staff." "You sure you know what you're doing?" She forced a tight smile. "Yes, sir. Let me grab my toolbox from the cart." He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her every move, as though expecting her to steal something. When she unclogged the sink in under 2 minutes, he said a gruff, "Thank you," and walked away without meeting her gaze. Moments like that reminded her of the pervasive prejudice around every corner. Yet she found solace in the knowledge she was capable of learning, fixing, improving. She clung to that sense of worth, using it to stifle the bitter taste of bigotry. That evening, after logging out, she escaped to the library again. She found a corner desk by the tall windows. The setting sun painted the sky in ribbons of orange and purple, shining light on the pages she read. Stories of people who started with nothing and built fortunes. Entrepreneurs who overcame systemic barriers. She drew inspiration from them, scribbling notes in a small spiral notebook. One name she jotted multiple times. Harvest Crown. She wrote questions. Who owns Harvest Crown? Is it part of a chain? Do they franchise? How to invest in or buy property? She had no illusions about waltzing up with her meagre bank account and purchasing a major hotel. Still, understanding the structure might give her a path forward. "All storms pass," Rod's voice repeated in her mind. She had begun to wonder if, in the far future, she might do more than just survive the storm. Maybe she could harness it. But every small stride forward was met with more hostility at work. One day Miss Pilcher handed Genevieve a disciplinary note, claiming she'd left a guest's bed unmade. Genevieve swore she'd done no such thing, and Marta confirmed it. But Miss Pilcher refused to remove the warning from her file. The frustration turned to heartbreak when a week later Mr. Crenshaw confronted Genevieve in the hallway. "I see you're still with us," he said coldly, despite the negative feedback. "What negative feedback?" she asked, pulse racing. He waved a slip of paper, some alleged complaint about unclean surfaces in room 805. She frowned. She distinctly remembered cleaning that room thoroughly. A moment of realization sunk in. They were looking for excuses to fire her. She appealed to Miss Pilcher, who only shrugged. "It's Crenshaw's call." That night, dread coiled in Genevieve's stomach. She desperately needed the paycheck. She was behind on rent, her mother's health bills were piling up. If she lost this job now, what would she do? But a quiet determination also surfaced. If they wanted her out, they'd have to work harder. She resolved to keep a near fanatical standard, leaving no corners unswept. She would document her daily tasks in a small notebook, a personal record to dispute any false claims. She refused to buckle. Through the tears and frustration, she whispered a mantra to herself. "I will not be invisible. I will not let them beat me." Little did she know how crucial her determination would become, nor how her life would drastically shift, turning those scribbled notes into something far more powerful than a daydream. A biting December wind swept through Atlanta, making the city's skyline shimmer under overcast skies. Genevieve's daily commute became a slog through chill and drizzle. On the job, the holiday season meant a hotel packed with travelers, visiting relatives, or celebrating events. The bustle could have brought holiday cheer, if not for the undercurrent of tension swirling around her. Genevieve had begun implementing her new strategy, meticulous documentation. Each morning, she'd note the rooms she was assigned, the cleaning tasks completed, the approximate time spent. If she encountered anything unusual, a malfunctioning sink, a rude guest, she jotted that down too. Rod teased her about it. "You're building a case, huh?" he said with a grin. She'd only shrug. "I'm making sure I have proof if they accuse me of something again." In the evenings, she split her time between extra library reading and online job searches, though her limited funds for internet access slowed her progress. She discovered Harvest Crown was indeed part of a small chain that included 2 other hotels in the region, one in Savannah, another in Charleston. She fantasized about how that chain might grow if it were handled by someone with real vision, someone who valued staff and recognized potential. On a particularly grueling day, Ms. Pilcher assigned Genevieve to strip and wax all the floors on the 10th level, normally a multi-person task. Genevieve struggled alone for hours, scrubbing until her arms ached. By midnight, she was only half done. She pressed on, silently cursing the system that forced her into this. At around 1 a.m., Mr. Crenshaw appeared, dressed in a crisp dark suit despite the late hour. "Still here?" he asked. She didn't bother to hide her exhaustion. "I was told to finish the floor waxing." He glanced around with mild disapproval. "Not done yet, I see." Her tired bones screamed for her to lash out, but she bit her tongue. "I'm doing my best, sir." He grunted. Without a word of encouragement or thanks, he turned away. That moment solidified Genevieve's resolve. One day, I'll be in a position where I don't have to endure this. She didn't know how or when, but she clung to the idea. During the holidays, an incident rocked the housekeeping staff. A fellow housekeeper, Amelia, another black woman, had an altercation with a guest who'd made overtly racist remarks. The guest demanded Amelia be fired. Instead of defending her, management wrote Amelia up for causing disturbance. A hush fell over the staff lounge as whispers flew. "They're definitely targeting us." Genevieve comforted Amelia privately. "I'm so sorry," she said, hugging the older woman. Amelia sighed, tears in her eyes. "I've been dealing with this nonsense all my life. Just once, I'd like to see justice served." That night, Genevieve's rest was plagued by dreams of the Harvest Crown's halls, the carpets turning into quicksand that threatened to swallow her whole. But each time she jerked awake, she reminded herself, focus, learn, plan. A small breakthrough arrived in the form of an unexpected ally. One evening, as Genevieve cleaned an executive suite, the occupant, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, returned early. Instead of shooing Genevieve out, she struck up a conversation. "You do a thorough job," the woman said, noting the polished mirrors and spotless counters. "What's your name?" Genevieve, startled by the kindness, introduced herself. The woman, Dr. Rosalind Baker, turned out to be a professor of business at a university up north. She asked polite questions: where Genevieve was from, how long she'd been at the hotel, if she'd always wanted to be a housekeeper. Genevieve answered carefully, but something about Dr. Baker's sincerity coaxed out the truth. "No, ma'am, I had bigger dreams. Just ended up here for now." Dr. Baker listened intently, gleaning hints of the discrimination overshadowing Genevieve's daily life. She gently suggested, "If you ever consider going back to school or venturing into business, you might explore grants or scholarships. People think it's impossible, but sometimes you just have to know where to look." The encounter lasted only 15 minutes, but it sparked renewed hope. That same night, Genevieve researched adult education options. She discovered part-time programs at local colleges, though the tuition seemed daunting. Another swirl of frustration overcame her. "How will I afford that on a housekeeper's wage, especially with my mother's medical bills?" Yet that conversation with Dr. Baker was a reminder that not everyone in the world saw her as invisible or incompetent. Some recognized her potential. She carried that warmth with her during the bitter winter weeks, pushing back against daily microaggressions and staying one step ahead of Ms. Pilcher's demands. In January, the chain's regional director was set to visit. Management scrambled to beautify the hotel. Crenshaw was particularly tense, barking orders at staff to ensure perfection. Extra decor was brought in, fresh flowers placed at every corridor. Genevieve was assigned top priority floors, handling them with her usual methodical care. On the day of the regional director's arrival, Genevieve found herself alone in the staff lounge for a short break. She sipped water, her hands trembling from having scrubbed tile grout all morning. The door swung open. Mr. Crenshaw stepped inside. She froze, expecting another reprimand for wasting time. Instead, he merely stared at her, a faint sneer twisting his lips. "You realize a lot is riding on this visit," he said, voice low. "We can't afford sloppy work from the housekeeping department, so if you can't keep up, maybe you should just quit before you embarrass us." The directness of his insult took her breath away. She felt tears threaten, but locked them down. "I'm fully capable, sir," she managed. He grunted, stepping closer. "I'll be watching you, Ms. Daniels. One slip and you're gone." With that, he left. Genevieve stood there, heart hammering in her throat. In that instant, she resolved never to give him the satisfaction of chasing her out. She'd leave on her own terms, or she'd rise above him. She had no idea just how high above him she would rise. The regional director's visit became a whirlwind of forced smiles and frantic housekeeping. Genevieve was assigned to several VIP rooms, ensuring they were spotless for the arrival of corporate associates. Nerves buzzed under her skin. She'd meticulously notated everything in her personal log, down to the brand of air freshener used. On the big day, the staff lined up in the lobby to greet the visiting executives. A cheerful brunch was arranged in the conference hall, replete with fancy pastries and fruit displays. Genevieve felt a twinge of envy, watching from a distance as the managers dined on fine spreads. Housekeepers were told to remain invisible unless called upon. While vacuuming the corridor outside the conference hall, Genevieve saw Mr. Crenshaw leading a small group of corporate suits around the property. She recognized a tall, silver-haired woman among them as Ms. Harriet Vance, rumoured to be the regional director. Ms. Vance paused, gesturing with interest at the ornate decor. The group drifted closer. Genevieve tried to make herself scarce, but Ms. Vance caught sight of her and offered a polite nod. "Good morning," she said. "Hard at work, I see." Unsure of the protocol, Genevieve responded quietly, "Yes, ma'am. Just keeping everything tidy." Crenshaw quickly inserted himself. "This is Ms. Daniels, one of our newest housekeepers." His tone was calm, but Genevieve sensed tension in his eyes, like he was mentally reminding her not to mess up. Ms. Vance merely smiled. "Great job," she said, before they continued on their tour. It was a tiny moment of recognition, but it gave Genevieve a small boost. Someone high up in the chain had acknowledged her. The day ended without incident. Genevieve felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. That night, she texted Rod about how the visit went. Rod teased, "Guess you survived. Let's hope they leave us in peace now." But peace was short-lived. 2 days later, Miss Pilcher slapped Genevieve with yet another complaint, this time alleging she forgot to replenish towels in a guest room. Genevieve was sure she hadn't, but Miss Pilcher refused to hear her out. "Just sign this, acknowledging you received the warning." Genevieve's temper boiled. "I've noticed you keep giving me these baseless complaints, but not to others." Pilcher's expression hardened. "Are you implying something?" "I'm implying you're fabricating issues to push me out," Genevieve said, her voice trembling with anger she could barely contain. Pilcher sniffed. "Watch your tone." She tapped the paper. "Sign or we can discuss termination." Forced into a corner, Genevieve signed. She left the office feeling ill, tears pricking her eyes. She retreated to the staff lounge, where Marta and Amelia consoled her. "This is wrong," Amelia said. "We all see what's happening." Marta nodded. "I overheard Miss Pilcher telling Mr. Crenshaw they'd find a way to cut staff. They target certain people." Genevieve's chest felt heavy with despair, but a silent resolve crystallized. She'd gather her evidence. If it came to a confrontation, she'd have a record of every room she cleaned, every time she restocked towels. Determined to push forward, she sought small joys in the darkest corners, a smile from a grateful guest, a hot cup of cocoa in the staff lounge, the ability to pay a fraction of her mother's hospital bill. She also kept reading about business, property ownership, and success stories of people who started at the bottom. Each story gave her a measure of courage. One night, as she left the hotel after a grueling shift, she spotted Miss Vance stepping into a taxi at the curb. The regional director appeared to be travelling incognito, wearing casual clothes. On impulse, Genevieve found herself calling out softly, "Miss Vance?" The older woman turned, brows furrowed, then recognized Genevieve. "Oh yes. Miss Daniels, right? Housekeeping." Genevieve hesitated, then took a risk. "I just wanted to say, thanks for visiting our hotel. We've all been working extra hard." It wasn't exactly what she wanted to say, but it was a start. Ms. Vance smiled. "I could tell. The place was in top shape. That's not always a management achievement alone. Hard-working staff make the difference." There was a kindness in her tone that emboldened Genevieve. "If you ever have a moment, ma'am," she said carefully, "I'd love to discuss some ideas about how the housekeeping staff could be better supported. I'm seeing some challenges." Vance tilted her head. "That's an interesting proposition. I might be back in a few weeks for another check-in. We could talk then." Genevieve's pulse raced. "Thank you, Miss Vance. Safe travels." As the taxi pulled away, Genevieve marvelled at her own courage. She'd never stepped outside her place in that way before, especially not with someone so high in the corporate chain. Yet she recognised a potential ally. Maybe Ms. Vance could intervene, or at least listen to her concerns. The spark of hope propelled her through more late nights and early mornings. She sat in the library during her days off, devouring books on small business management and lodging industry trends. She scribbled new notes. Approach Miss Vance carefully. Outline staff concerns. Provide evidence of unfair write-ups. Still, the daily grind was unrelenting. Miss Pilcher's coldness sharpened. Mr. Crenshaw's stares grew more hostile. On some days, Genevieve nearly lost the will to fight. Her body sore, her spirit battered by seemingly endless discrimination. But whenever she felt close to giving up, she'd remember that fleeting conversation with Miss Vance, or think of her mother's voice telling her as a child, "You're meant for more." She clung to those glimmers of pride, fueling her determination to keep going. Little did she know, destiny would soon hinge on a single tipping point, where adversity and opportunity would collide, changing her path forever. By late winter, rumours circulated that an important meeting would be held at the Harvest Crown. Genevieve pieced together tidbits from overheard conversations. Apparently, the chain's board of directors would convene to discuss profits, expansions, and possibly a new direction for the brand. Most staff members were barred from these proceedings, but the buzz was undeniable. The entire hotel prepared, shining floors and updating decor. Meanwhile, Ms. Vance's name kept popping up. Rod confided to Genevieve that Ms. Vance had a strong voice in decision-making about manager placements. "If she disapproves of Crenshaw, she could move him," he said with a grin. Genevieve held on to that possibility like a lifeline. She'd been collecting evidence of her exemplary performance and the unfair reprimands. If Ms. Vance truly had power, perhaps Genevieve could show her the truth. The day before the board meeting, Miss Pilcher assigned Genevieve to a set of rooms on the 18th floor, supposedly off-limits to housekeeping until after the board sessions. "We need them done early," she insisted. "Don't question me, just do it." Confused, Genevieve took the elevator up to the 18th floor. It was quieter than usual. No guests, no staff. She found the designated rooms locked. She used her passkey, stepping inside an empty suite that smelled of fresh paint. The space had been cleared except for a large oval table and chairs. Must be a makeshift conference room, she thought. As she vacuumed, she noticed a folder left on the table, partially open. She moved to set it aside, but curiosity tugged at her. The top page read, "Harvest Crown Board Agenda." She glanced around, heart hammering. Should I look, she wondered. The policy forbade employees from snooping, but her thirst for knowledge got the better of her. She skimmed the first lines. Financial Outlook Manager, Performance Evaluations Potential Acquisition Offer. Her eyes widened. Acquisition offer. She read on, glimpsing a mention of interested investors looking to acquire controlling shares of Harvest Crown. The text was dense, but she picked out phrases like negotiations ongoing, chain rebranding potential, and evaluation of management staff. A wave of excitement surged. If an acquisition happened, maybe the old regime, Crenshaw included, would be ousted. Yet she felt a pang of anxiety, uncertain how that would affect lower-level staff. Would that mean layoffs? Or a complete revamp of the chain? She quickly closed the folder, guilt nipping at her conscience. But she couldn't unsee what she'd read. Determined to remain discreet, she finished vacuuming, dusted lightly, and hurried out. That evening, she confided in Rod. "I think the chain might be sold," she said, voice hushed. "If it does, we might get new owners." Rod sighed. Owners always change. Doesn't mean they'll do right by us. But maybe this is a chance. Genevieve nodded, feeling a flutter of hope. She recalled how she once dreamed of owning her own business. Her own hotel, even. The notion of a major chain acquisition reminded her that anything was possible if one had capital and the right backing. One day, maybe. The board meeting took place the next morning. The staff scurried around to cater, serve coffee, and keep everything pristine. Genevieve was assigned to the housekeeping station near the 18th floor, ready to respond to any immediate cleaning requests. She wore her best uniform, hair neatly styled. If Miss Vance was present, Genevieve hoped to catch a moment of her time. As executives arrived, Genevieve hovered discreetly in the hallway. She spotted Miss Vance speaking with a group that included a tall man in a navy blazer. Their expressions were serious. Eventually, they all filed into the suite, shutting the door behind them. The corridor fell silent, leaving Genevieve alone with her swirling thoughts. Hours passed. Genevieve busied herself cleaning a nearby supply closet, reorganizing the housekeeping cart. The tension built in her chest. She had to do something. Then, near midday, the door opened, and Miss Vance stepped out alone to make a phone call, pacing the hall. Genevieve summoned her courage. Taking a deep breath, she approached. "Excuse me, Miss Vance. May I speak with you for just a moment?" Vance looked up, recognized her, and lowered her phone. "Yes, Miss Daniels, was it?" "Yes, ma'am," Genevieve said, heart pounding. She swallowed. "I know this might be out of line, but I have concerns about how some staff are treated, and I wanted to share my experiences here. I've faced repeated disciplinary actions for things I didn't do, and I see patterns of discrimination." Ms. Vance's brow furrowed. "That's serious. Have you taken it to HR?" Genevieve nodded. "They won't listen. Mr. Crenshaw is tight with them. I've documented everything. I'm worried about losing my job if I speak out, but I can't stay silent." Vance's gaze softened. She motioned toward the side alcove. "Let's talk briefly." Genevieve produced her small notebook, flipping through entries. She showed Miss Vance specific dates, times, and tasks completed, along with contradictory write-ups. She pointed out how some housekeeping staff, particularly Black and Latino employees, received more complaints, while others rarely did. Ms. Vance took in every detail, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her face remained calm, but Genevieve sensed a growing concern behind her eyes. Finally, Ms. Vance said, "This is quite a lot. I appreciate your courage in bringing it forward. I can't make promises immediately, but I'll look into it." Genevieve's chest felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. She was relieved to be heard, yet anxious about the fallout if Crenshaw found out. "Thank you for your time," she said. "I'll keep doing my job, but please help us if you can." Ms. Vance gave a small nod. "Understood." Then she excused herself, returning to the meeting. In the hours that followed, Genevieve's stomach churned with nerves. She half expected Mr. Crenshaw to storm out and fire her on the spot. But the corridor remained silent. The meeting extended into late afternoon when the executives finally departed in Blacktown cars. Genevieve's shift ended. She left the Harvest Crown, feeling an odd mix of trepidation and hope. By stepping into the line of fire, she might have triggered events she couldn't control, but at least she'd refused to remain unseen, unheard. The next day, Miss Pilcher's mood was even icier, but she said nothing about the meeting. Mr. Crenshaw was conspicuously absent, allegedly in conference calls. Tension rippled through the staff. Some rumoured that the chain was indeed being sold. Others insisted it was just a routine board meeting. Genevieve toiled on, a quiet sense of purpose rooting itself in her heart. One step at a time, she was learning the ropes, forging connections, building her own intangible power. She sensed a change on the horizon, one that might crack open the rigid walls of Harvest Crown and let in a wave of new possibilities. A week after the board meeting, word spread that the chain's owners had entertained multiple offers from investors. One rumour, whispered among staff, claimed Harriet Vance herself had a stake in deciding which offer to accept. Another rumour insisted the chain might remain under current ownership, but with a major shake-up in management. Genevieve carried on with her routine, though the atmosphere felt charged, like the hotel was holding its breath. Ms. Pilcher pushed housekeeping to extremes. Staff numbers dwindled on certain shifts, forcing Genevieve to handle double the workload. She suspected it was a ploy to make her slip up, but she maintained her meticulous notes and somehow kept pace. One afternoon, as Genevieve polished the mirrors in a lower-level conference room, Amelia hurried in, excitement brimming in her eyes. "Girl, you won't believe this. Miss Pilcher just got chewed out by Ms. Vance." Genevieve set her rag down. "Wait, Ms. Vance is back?" "Yes, and apparently she demanded to see housekeeping logs. She confronted Pilcher about inconsistent write-ups. Pilcher was stumbling, trying to explain." Genevieve felt a thrill of vindication. What happened next? "I only caught bits, but Ms. Pilcher was practically shaking. Then Ms. Vance walked away, saying she'd speak to Crenshaw too." Adrenaline surged in Genevieve's veins. This was the first tangible proof that her conversation with Ms. Vance had an effect. She forced herself to stay calm. No need to celebrate openly and risk retaliation. But inside, she felt something shift. The slightest breeze of justice. Sure enough, that evening, Miss Pilcher summoned Genevieve to her office. Gone was the usual haughty demeanour. She seemed oddly subdued, eyes skittering to avoid Genevieve's. "I've reviewed your performance logs," Pilcher said, voice tight. "It appears there might have been misunderstandings in certain complaints." Genevieve stiffened, heart thrashing. "Yes, ma'am." Pilcher cleared her throat. "So we're removing those prior disciplinary notes from your record, effective immediately." Genevieve blinked. She almost couldn't believe her ears. "Thank you," she managed. Pilcher waved a dismissive hand. "Don't thank me, just keep working diligently, that'll be all." Stepping out of the office, Genevieve clutched her chest, tears of relief prickling at the corners of her eyes. The false warnings had been erased. She was free from that looming threat of termination, at least for now. The next day brought more change. Rod reported overhearing Crenshaw on a tense phone call, presumably with the chain's higher-ups. "He was pacing the hallway, cursing under his breath," Rod said, chuckling. "Never seen him look so rattled." A small smile tugged at Genevieve's lips. Perhaps Miss Vance was investigating him more deeply. She tried not to indulge in vengeful glee, but it was hard not to feel a surge of triumph. Crenshaw deserved scrutiny for fostering a discriminatory environment. Days passed with no sightings of Crenshaw. Rumour had it he'd been temporarily relocated to the Savannah branch to address management concerns. Miss Pilcher also stepped lightly, no longer harassing Genevieve and other minority staff with the same vigour. Morale among housekeepers noticeably improved. One bright afternoon, as Genevieve took a short break in the staff lounge, Marta and Amelia joined her. The three women sipped lukewarm coffee from paper cups, exchanging weary smiles. "I can't believe how much calmer it feels," Marta said. "Even Pilcher keeps to herself." Amelia nodded. "Girl, I swear it's like we can breathe again." Then she fixed Genevieve with a grateful stare. "I think you had something to do with this." Genevieve's cheeks warmed. I just told Ms. Vance the truth. But yes, maybe it helped. Marta patted Genevieve's shoulder. We appreciate you standing up. Maybe you're too humble to see it, but you gave us all a voice. Emotions welled up in Genevieve. She realized how pivotal that meeting with Ms. Vance had been, not just for her personal relief, but for every marginalized employee under Harvest Crown's roof. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Later that week, Ms. Vance herself approached Genevieve in the lobby. She wore a tailored navy suit and exuded calm confidence. Miss Daniels, can I have a word? Genevieve led her to a quiet corner by a tall potted plant. Ms. Vance offered a faint smile. I wanted you to know that I've taken your statement seriously. We've launched an internal review. You should start seeing some positive changes around here. Thank you, Genevieve said, pulse fluttering with relief. I'm really grateful. Ms. Vance nodded. Keep up your excellent work, and if any more issues arise, HR at the corporate level is aware of your situation. You can bypass local management if needed. Genevieve's eyes widened at the implied safety net. She bowed her head. I appreciate it. Before leaving, Miss Vance added, You know, if you ever choose to go further in this industry, you have potential. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Those words reverberated in Genevieve's mind long after Miss Vance walked away. She locked them in her heart as proof that she could dream bigger. For the first time, she felt like maybe the future wasn't an impenetrable wall. It might be a gate she could unlock, and a gate she fully intended to open, step by determined step. With Crenshaw absent and Pilcher under a corporate microscope, Genevieve found a new sense of purpose at the Harvest Crown. No longer shackled by false write-ups, she focused on excellence in her work, but also on self-improvement. She returned to her studies, finishing library books on real estate investing and entrepreneurial strategy. The more she read, the more her mind exploded with ideas. One concept in particular grabbed her attention: group investing. She learned that individuals of modest means sometimes pooled resources to purchase property. If she could find the right partners, like-minded folks who believed in collective ownership, maybe they could own small assets, or even bigger ventures someday. Still, it felt like a lofty dream. She was making slightly above minimum wage, with no immediate prospects for large capital. Her mother's medical bills continued piling up. Yet the notion refused to leave her head. She started jotting possibilities in her notebook. Form an investment club. Begin with smaller real estate. Grow returns. Eventually buy into hotel ownership. She wasn't naive enough to think she'd be purchasing the Harvest Crown next month. But over the years, maybe. The prospect lit a quiet fire in her spirit. Meanwhile, the environment at the hotel gradually lifted. The new corporate watchers ensured staff were treated more fairly. Miss Pilcher wouldn't even glance at Genevieve if she could avoid it, as though knowing she'd lost her power to bully. Other housekeepers, too, reported fewer negative run-ins. Genevieve expanded her network among staff, befriending the night receptionist, a Jamaican immigrant named Colleen, who had stories of working her way through community college. She also got acquainted with a few newly hired bellhops. She asked subtle questions. Have you ever thought about business ownership? Do you know others who might want to invest together? She found that many were intrigued. But we never have enough money, a bellhop named Marcus lamented. We're scraping by. Genevieve would nod, acknowledging the hardship. I know, but if we start small, maybe we can build something over time. She told them about group investing she'd read about. A spark occasionally lit in their eyes, though some remained skeptical. Despite the improved atmosphere, Genevieve sometimes glimpsed the old tension flicker back. She heard rumours that Crenshaw was furious about being sidelined. He would occasionally call the hotel, barking orders from afar. Miss Pilcher tried to keep a low profile, though once Genevieve overheard Pilcher on the phone, speaking in urgent tones about protecting management's interests. Still, no direct confrontation arose. Weeks rolled into months. Genevieve saved what little she could. She cut back on expenses, skipping bus rides to walk home, or packing lunches to avoid vending machine snacks. Every few dollars she put away felt like a stepping stone to something bigger. One day, as she was scrubbing the second-floor hallway, Harriet Vance showed up unexpectedly. Genevieve straightened, offering a polite greeting. Ms. Vance asked how things were. Genevieve hesitated, then confessed she was still worried about any potential meltdown if Crenshaw returned. But overall it was more positive. Miss Vance considered her words. "Corporate is deliberating a larger reorganization," she said. "Nothing's final yet, but I have strong opinions on how certain managers should be handled." Genevieve took a leap. "Forgive me if this is too bold, but I'd like to see an environment where staff can grow, a place that invests in its own employees." Vance's eyes flickered with interest. "That's a forward-thinking approach." Feeling emboldened, Genevieve pressed on. "Right now, I'm trying to learn more about the hotel industry's business side. I want to eventually, well, someday I dream of being in management, even ownership." A surprised grin spread across Miss Vance's face. "Ownership? That's ambitious, but I won't discourage you. The hospitality industry can always use new perspectives, especially from those who know it firsthand." Genevieve's heart soared. She parted ways with Miss Vance, feeling that she'd found another mentor-like figure. She hoped that if the chain restructured, Miss Vance might foster a more inclusive environment. That evening, her mother called from the clinic, sounding tired but comforted by the fact that Genevieve was holding down a steady job. Genevieve didn't share the dream of hotel ownership. It felt too grandiose to say out loud, especially while her mother battled chronic illness. But hearing her mother's voice reminded Genevieve why she fought so hard to earn a living. If only she could earn more, invest, and break the cycle of living paycheck to paycheck. Spring arrived in a burst of warm sunlight and blooming azaleas across Atlanta. The hotel's occupancy swelled with new travelers. Genevieve juggled her housekeeping duties with a side hustle of sorts. She'd occasionally do laundry for guests' personal clothing on her off hours for a small fee, or help them with last-minute errands. She put those tips directly into a savings jar. She also quietly reached out to staff who'd expressed interest in a possible group investment idea. While none of them had much to contribute, a handful were intrigued enough to discuss pooling resources. "Even if we only raise a few thousand, that could be a down payment on a small property," Genevieve suggested. "A tiny flip house, maybe. They'd fix it up, sell or rent it, then reinvest profits." It was slow going, with many losing interest or doubting it would ever happen. But a kernel of a plan was forming. Genevieve stayed up late, scribbling potential budgets, scanning real estate listings for fixer-uppers. She might not have the finances yet, but she was building knowledge. Unbeknownst to her, bigger tides were shifting behind the scenes. The Harvest Crown Board was nearing a decision that would eventually change her life forever, paving the way for the unimaginable. A chance at actual hotel ownership. Genevieve was about to see her dreams and her reality collide in a most unexpected fashion. The reorganization news finally broke. An investment firm had reached a deal with the current owners to buy a controlling stake in the Harvest Crown chain. The entire staff buzzed with questions. Who were the investors? Would they keep existing managers or hire new ones? Rumours flew like sparks in a dry field. A few days later, a memo arrived from corporate. The chain's name would remain Harvest Crown for brand recognition, but significant structural changes would occur. Harriet Vance was appointed as an interim regional director with expanded authority to audit each hotel and recommend new leadership if necessary. Genevieve marvelled at Miss Vance's ascendancy. Finally, someone with sense is in charge, she thought. She secretly hoped Miss Vance would remove Miss Pilcher for her previous misconduct. Meanwhile, an unexpected second memo circulated, a new program encouraging employee development. Titled the Grow With Us Initiative, it offered partial tuition reimbursement for job-related courses and promised a clear path for staff to move into supervisory roles if they met certain criteria. The pamphlet asked employees to submit an interest form, detailing their career goals. Genevieve's heart soared as she read it. She couldn't help but suspect Ms. Vance had a hand in creating such a program. This was her opportunity. She'd been devouring business books for months. If the chain would help cover some school costs, she could realistically enroll in community college classes on hospitality management or business administration. She raced to fill out the interest form. Under position sought, she wrote supervisory or managerial track. Under long-term goals, she boldly penned hotel ownership. It felt surreal, but she promised herself not to shrink her dreams. When she turned the form into HR, she braced for cynicism. But to her surprise, the new HR coordinator, a friendly black woman named Camila, smiled widely. "We've received quite a few forms, but yours definitely stands out. Good luck." A week later, Genevieve was summoned for an initial interview regarding her application to the program. She entered a small conference room, finding Ms. Vance seated at a table with two other corporate representatives. Nervous sweat beaded on Genevieve's forehead as she greeted them, but Ms. Vance's reassuring nod steadied her. They asked about Genevieve's background, what she'd learned on the job, her challenges, and her vision for the future. Genevieve spoke candidly about the housekeeping experience, how it gave her insight into the operational side of hotels. She cited the discrimination issues, framing them as areas the chain could address through better training and inclusive policies. She concluded by expressing her passion for entrepreneurship, referencing real estate knowledge she'd been acquiring. Ms. Vance seemed genuinely impressed. The interview ended with polite smiles and a promise to inform her soon about next steps. Genevieve floated through the rest of her shift, heart pounding with anticipation. Within a few days, she got word. She'd been accepted into the Grow With Us initiative, starting with an online course in Hospitality 101 funded by the chain. If she passed, more advanced courses would follow. Genevieve nearly cried in relief. She called her mother, who cried too, whispering about how proud she was of her daughter. Work took on a new meaning. She had direction now. Each day was one step closer to transitioning from housekeeping to a more strategic role. She spent lunch breaks studying course material. Sometimes she'd arrive early to pop into the hotel's small business centre and watch tutorial videos. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Miss Pilcher glowered whenever Genevieve's name came up. Meanwhile, Crenshaw's looming return still cast a shadow. Rumour had it he was fighting the corporate changes tooth and nail. But with Ms. Vance backing the new initiative, his power waned. Genevieve excelled in her first online course, finishing top of the class. That caught Ms. Vance's attention, leading to a second set of courses, managerial training modules, combined with monthly mentorship sessions. Before long, Genevieve was balancing a nearly full-time job, plus rigorous studies. It was grueling, but the excitement of advancement fueled her. During this time, she reconnected with her small circle at the hotel who'd been curious about group investing. Encouraged by her educational progress, they formed a tiny, cooperative club, depositing $50 to $100 per month each into a shared account. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They joked that maybe one day they'd buy a little motel on the outskirts of town. All the while, Genevieve maintained a humble presence at Harvest Crown, scrubbing floors and changing linens whenever assigned. Some new hires wondered why she was still in housekeeping if she was on a management track. She'd just smile and say, "I'm learning every aspect from the ground up." The transformation within Genevieve was evident to those who knew her best. Marta teased that Genevieve had a boss lady glow. Rod often pulled her aside, whispering, "You're gonna go far. I can feel it." Little did they realize just how far she'd ultimately ascend, culminating in a momentous event that would shake the entire chain to its core. The seeds planted in those months would soon bear fruit, catapulting Genevieve into a realm she had only dared to dream about. A year later, Harvest Crown and its sister hotels were nearly unrecognizable compared to the old days under Crenshaw's reign. Ms. Vance's leadership had ushered in new policies, better training, and an overall atmosphere of respect. Pilcher's hostility had faded, likely due to numerous warnings. Rumour had it she was close to resignation, though she clung to her role for now. In that time, Genevieve had advanced through the Grow With Us initiative. She'd passed multiple courses, earning a certificate in hospitality management. She'd begun shadowing an assistant manager, learning about budgeting, ordering supplies, and conflict resolution. It was surreal to see how far she'd come from scrubbing floors alone at midnight, terrified of false accusations. Meanwhile, her small investment club had grown slightly, attracting a few more members. They saved diligently, soon having a modest fund of a few $1,000s. They toyed with the idea of buying a rundown duplex to renovate. Genevieve championed the plan, but they decided to wait a bit longer until the pot grew. Then everything changed overnight. The corporate owners decided to sell the entire Harvest Crown chain. Apparently, the new investors had parted ways. Another buyer was needed. The staff panicked, fearful of job cuts. Ms. Vance was in an uproar, trying to secure a stable future for the chain. A shocking rumour circulated. Crenshaw had found wealthy backers and wanted to purchase the chain himself, presumably to reinstate the old regime. A wave of dread swept through employees who remembered his bigoted management style. "He's aiming to buy it all," staff whispered, "and then we'll be out on the street." Genevieve's stomach churned. She'd poured a year into building a better environment, only for the old tyrant to potentially seize control. She confided in Ms. Vance, who admitted she was fighting behind the scenes to find an alternative buyer. But big corporations either offered too low a price or were uninterested in a mid-sized hotel chain. Late one night, after a draining shift, Genevieve sat at her modest kitchen table, staring at her investment club's ledger. A wild, outlandish idea pricked her mind. What if we tried to buy it ourselves? The notion seemed absurd. Her club had a few $1,000s, nowhere near the millions needed. But maybe they didn't have to do it alone. Maybe they could find other investors who believed in an employee-led model. Genevieve spent sleepless nights researching cooperative ownership structures. She discovered case studies of workers who had collectively bought businesses to save them from closure. Of course, the scale of a hotel chain was infinitely larger, but her heart refused to let the idea go. She approached Ms. Vance discreetly. What if the employees pooled resources, sought outside backing, and made a bid. Ms. Vance blinked, stunned. That's quite ambitious. Genevieve's voice trembled with passion. I know, but we have so many capable staff who care about the brand. If we can secure a group of investors who see the potential, we might stand a chance. Ms. Vance rubbed her temples. The price tag is enormous. I'm not sure how it could work, but if you have a plan, I'm willing to listen. Working day and night, Genevieve assembled a proposal. She pitched an employee-led buyout in which staff would own shares, guided by a leadership council. They'd approach philanthropic funds or socially conscious investors who supported minority leadership and inclusive workplaces. Ms. Vance, impressed by Genevieve's tenacity, arranged discreet meetings with potential backers. To everyone's astonishment, momentum gathered. Certain funds were drawn to the idea of a black-led consortium acquiring the chain. Media interest spiked. Frontline workers aimed to purchase their own hotel chain, made for a compelling narrative. Genevieve found herself giving an impassioned pitch to a room of suited investors, describing a vision for a progressive, employee-first hospitality model. Her voice shook, but her conviction shone through. In the background, Crenshaw's own bid faltered. Rumour said his backers grew wary of negative press from his checkered management history. Meanwhile, the employee-led initiative gained traction. A combination of private equity, philanthropic funds, and a newly formed Harvest Employee Cooperative put together an offer that rivaled Crenshaw's. Ms. Vance quietly championed their cause, presenting data that indicated staff-led ownership could boost customer loyalty and brand reputation. The negotiations were tense, dragging on for weeks. Genevieve barely slept. She'd clock in for housekeeping shifts, still humbly pulling her weight, then spend her off hours fine-tuning financial spreadsheets and marketing proposals with Ms. Vance's counsel. The possibility of failure loomed, but a wave of grassroots support buoyed them. People across the country cheered on the underdogs. Finally, the day arrived. The board announced the winning bid. In a dramatic turn of events, they rejected Crenshaw's offer, citing insufficient capital and concerns about his management track record. Instead, they accepted the employee-led cooperative's proposal, conditional on finalizing certain financing details within a strict timeline. Genevieve and Ms. Vance scrambled to meet the conditions. The staff scrambled too, many pledging small amounts of their own money. Philanthropic investors added the lion's share. It was a patchwork of funding, but it worked. When the official documents were signed, the chain was reborn under the new ownership model. Ms. Vance stepped into a top executive role, ensuring strategic oversight. She immediately offered Genevieve a new position, Director of Staff Relations, acknowledging her role as the heart of the employee-led revolution. Staff would also receive shares, giving them a tangible stake. Genevieve stood on the dais at the official announcement, tears in her eyes. She looked out at the faces of housekeeping colleagues, bellhops, and new supporters. In the front row sat Rod, Amelia, Marta, beaming with pride. Even Miss Pilcher had resigned quietly a few days prior, replaced by a more inclusive manager. No trace of the old regime tarnished the moment. Then, as though the universe demanded poetic justice, Crenshaw appeared at the back of the room, arms folded, expression dark. He'd come to witness the final blow. Ms. Vance invited him to speak if he wished, but he declined, stomping away. Genevieve felt a pang of triumph and relief. The man who once tried to force her out now watched her and her peers take the reins. The next week, with final transitions underway, Ms. Vance offered Genevieve a chance to address the staff. She faced an assembly in the grand ballroom, her heart pounding. She spoke of the journey from invisible housekeeper to part owner of the chain, how everyone's contributions mattered. regardless of race or background. She promised a brighter future for Harvest Crown, grounded in respect, fairness, and opportunity for all. After rousing applause, Ms. Vance passed Genevieve an embossed letter. "Our new CEO has read your file," she said with a smile. "They'd like you to personally oversee improvements in staff conditions across all the chain's properties. Effective immediately, you'll be traveling to each site, ensuring best practices are followed." Genevieve's jaw dropped. The letter confirmed she'd be a traveling consultant with a formidable salary and the power to implement the changes she'd once only dreamed of. In a final act of personal closure, Genevieve stood in what used to be Crenshaw's office, now vacant. She stared at the imposing desk where he once reviewed false complaints. She recalled the humiliations, the casual racism, the microaggressions. Then she picked up the phone, called the HR coordinator, and said calmly, "We'll need to finalize the termination of Mr. Leo Crenshaw's contract. We have no place for him in this new era." HR confirmed it without hesitation. It was done. That night, Genevieve returned to her modest apartment. She stood at her kitchen table, now stacked with paperwork from the cooperative. A swirl of emotions overtook her. Gratitude, pride, disbelief. She thought of her younger self, doodling pictures of future businesses. She had never envisioned exactly this path. But it was even more profound. She'd fought prejudice, advocated for her colleagues, and emerged not just as a lone victor, but a champion for everyone who'd been overlooked. As she stared at her reflection in the window, she whispered a promise. "I'll never forget where I came from, or who helped me get here. And I'll make this hotel chain shine for every worker who dreams bigger." And in the stillness of that night, the city lights glowed with a fresh sort of magic, one that assured her this was only the beginning of her new calling, lifting others as she continued her ascent, ensuring the Harvest Crown would never again cast its shadow on those who worked beneath its grand halls. Years later, Genevieve Daniels, now widely known as CEO Daniels, walked the halls of the flagship Harvest Crown in Atlanta. She paused to greet staff by name: housekeepers, bellhops, receptionists. She still wore comfortable shoes, never forgetting the long hours spent on her feet in a grey housekeeping uniform. The chain had flourished under her guidance, expanding to new cities, praised in the press for its equitable treatment of employees. Guest satisfaction soared, brand loyalty reached new heights. And not a day passed that Genevieve didn't remember her roots. In her plush office, a single plaque hung behind the desk. "Empathy and vision transform all." It served as a quiet reminder of her journey from the shadows of discrimination to the light of triumph, a journey she'd always carry in her soul.